Well, good evening, everybody. This is Michael Lee in Bologna. I apologize for the slight delay. We had one or two technical problems. I hope you can see and hear me now. I can.
Good evening, Michael. It's Helen Campbell here. I can hear and see you loud and clear.
Excellent. Good evening, Helen. It's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to this webinar that we're holding from Johns Hopkins University, SAIS in Bologna in Italy. We would have very much hoped to have you here with us in Bologna so we could have a discussion in person, which traditionally is followed at the very least by a nice pizza dinner or a gastronomic experience in one of the wonderful restaurants in Bologna. But we're having to adapt to the particular circumstances of COVID, and I'm extremely grateful to you, Helen, for being with us. Now, as our participants have received the announcement, which included a resume of your career, I'm not going to begin by introducing you at any length, and I think that some of your career experiences are going to come out in the course of our conversation. But just to say to everyone that Helen Campbell is an enormously experienced European Union civil servant who is now working in the European External Action Service and has had a number of extremely interesting and demanding appointments in the course of her career in the Commission, as a diplomat, as an ambassador. And so we're going to come to those various experiences in the course of our conversation. You have the possibility to ask questions, and you can pose your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And if you submit questions in the Q&A, then after we've completed our initial conversation, I will open up those questions and pose some of them to Helen. But I'd like to begin, Helen, by just recalling that you began your career as a British civil servant posted to the permanent representation of the United Kingdom in Brussels before joining the Commission. So for our students and others who are interested in careers both in national civil services and in international organizations, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came by these interesting and demanding jobs, and also some of the similarities and differences of working for national civil services on the one side and the European institutions on the other.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and good evening to everybody who's listening online tonight. Just to wind back a little bit, when I left university, I joined the British civil service as a management trainee. So before I got into the European side of things, I spent 3 years working as a manager, being trained in various jobs, from working even in an unemployment office in Tottenham for a while, for working in policy departments in the Department of Employment head office. And along came 1989, and this dates me, when there was a search for German speakers, and I'm a German speaker. So one of my managers at the time picked that up and said, what did I feel about going to Berlin for a few weeks to start to look at what we could do to support the transition process that had just happened there. So, when the Berlin Wall came, that really was a seminal moment for me personally and in career terms. And then I started to take a European turn in my career. I was nominated for an internal application to the Fast Stream program of the British Civil Service, which, if any of you are British, is certainly something worth taking a very good look at. And those were very different days to now, because I joined something called the European Fast Stream, and Michael Lee knows many others who've come that route into the administration in Brussels. So once I joined that scheme, I was very quickly posted to the UK permanent representation in Brussels. I benefited immensely from the training the British gave me. One thing I particularly look at today is I spent, I think, 3 weeks with a group of lawyers and some generalists such as myself, being sent around the European institutions to learn about European law and practice. I also had many training courses from Outward Bound, where we were taken abseiling to much more intellectual courses on government and policy process. So I look back many times now in my work to the really good training I had as being part of a group joining the civil service at the same time in the UK. I then came into the European Commission, with many thanks indeed to Michael Lee, and on a secondment for a couple of years working in the cabinet of Hans van den Broek, the then commissioner. And while I was there, I took the competitions to join the European Commission. I think at the time, if I recall correctly, there were 75,000 people taking 2 competitions for a few hundred places on a waiting list. And I was one of the lucky few to make it through that. And I think my first remark in that sense is that I love working for the European Commission, but it's a very different animal from a national civil service. We have everybody speaks 2 or 3 languages. We have a very, very high level of staff. I think it's very, very good, but you need to be a lot more self-sufficient perhaps in the way than you do in a national civil service. So Michael, that would be my first remarks on that, but I think I benefit immensely from having had that mix of backgrounds. I think in a national civil service, also understanding what the European Union means to member states. I think to have been on both sides of the table is an enormous asset, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but really benefited from that training and background as well.
Well, we'll come back to the takeaways from your experiences, because I think some of the students who are participating this evening will be thinking about careers for themselves, and perhaps they'd be interested in any advice you may have for them, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. But just following through a little bit on your career, and also for students who might be thinking about this, I think one of the really attractive things, thinking back to my own career as well, about working for the European institutions is the wide range of fields that you can work in, and the fact that it's not only possible, but it's actually expected and encouraged that you would shift from one area to another. Can you give us a sense of how that works in the Commission? When you think back to your own career moves, were these things that you prepared for in advance, you campaigned for, or were you nudged into these moves by your bosses? How does it work in practice?
I think it's a little bit of everything, Michael, in a way. I've probably been through all of that. I think when I first passed the competition, I had the benefit of both having the experience of working for a national government, which was very sought after in a permanent representation, but also because I had had the secondment to the cabinet of knowing people. So that made my first move in off the waiting list much easier than that might be for others. After that, I was very lucky for the first few years. I think it was more a question of being nudged or encouraged. But then in my more recent career, we have in the External Action Service, we have a 4-year policy of mobility. So everybody has to move jobs every 4 years. And I think that I see as a very healthy thing. So my first post in the External Action Service was as head of the Policy Coordination Division. Then I had to move after that. So I went and did something completely different, which was applied for the job as head of delegation ambassador to Norway. And for that, yes, you do have to do a little bit of lobbying in terms of people have to know who you are, you have to justify your case. But the longer I've been in the service, I think the more objective the selection processes are getting, certainly in the External Action Service. Then when I came back from Norway, I was in our mobility process, so I had to express interest in posts, but I didn't actually have to go through a formal process. So I've been through all sorts of different processes along the way, but my feeling now and the impression of the organizations is that it's much more based now on actually really having to apply for jobs and compete for them. So there's an internal labor market in that sense. But I think it does obviously help to know where you're going. Competition is very tough for interesting jobs as well. So you know, I think for people coming in now, the situation is rather different than it was when I joined. Yeah,
I remember when I began many moons ago working in the European institutions, and you heard people talking and you got advice. They would always say that they use this French word you don't hear so much anymore, piston. Piston, what does that mean? How does that translate into English? I mean, it meant you really had to have somebody standing behind you to support you to, and if you wanted a career move, you needed support from your home government, the country you knew best, or from some boss you worked for, who knows, some family member or whatever. If it ever worked like that, I don't know, but I'm very encouraged to hear you say that these days you think things are much more objective and that people are appointed to positions much more on their merits than used to be the case.
And we have, for example, for posts, more senior posts in the External Action Service, you have to go through an assessment centre for your first management post. And that's quite radical, I think, compared to where things were maybe 10, 20 years ago, which is a very positive change. And of course, when I passed the competition, it was very much a paper-based exercise with an interview at the end. Now it's very much based on competencies. It's a different sort of test. So I think we've moved on quite a long way on that. Of course, it helps to understand the organization. So having contacts is clearly beneficial in that sense. And I think also to see opportunities coming isn't always very easy. So to have a good network is clearly still very important, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah, we reflect that a little bit at SAIS, and I think although academic excellence is still at the core of what we do, there's much more emphasis than there used to be on acquiring professional skills, because I think this is something that's truly important. And in the new degree program that I run, the Masters of European Public Policy, we really put almost as much emphasis on acquiring the skills you need, not just to work in the institutions, but to work in this whole sort of fauna and flora around the institutions, NGOs, think tanks, lobby organizations, public affairs, government affairs, all of that. So I think that this shift towards greater professionalism is something which we in the academic world are trying to parallel as well.
That's good, Mike. If I can just come in on that point, I think one thing I would say, and we'll come back to this later, is when I've been on the end of recruiting staff, either in Brussels or when I was in the delegation in Norway, we're talking for most entry-level posts of 50 to 100 applicants. So there really needs to be something to mark somebody out. I can almost assume the academic level, but to have the experience alongside or something special to bring as well is now becoming almost essential, I think. And you have with SAIS a very good reputation. It's well known, but I think it's really challenging now to get the good entry-level jobs, and it requires a lot of effort to go for that level.
That's very good advice, a very useful observation. Let's move on a bit to talk about some of the substantive policy fields that you've worked in. You spent some years on enlargement that I was also busy with, and neighborhood policy. In fact, we met through this work, and we worked together for some years. Looking back and thinking about current issues that the EU is facing with some of the not so new member states anymore. We still sometimes call them new member states, but actually most of them joined in 2004, 16 years ago. But rule of law issues, particularly now with Poland and Hungary. But looking back, do you think that we rushed too fast into enlargement after the collapse of communism? Should we have taken more time? Were our expectations too high?
It's a very difficult question. I think hindsight is a wonderful thing in history and politics. And I think many historians have written the what if books. And I was actually talking to a friend from Eastern Europe recently about this. And I remember, and Michael will remember this as well, when we were trying to set the criteria for enlargement in the very early days of the process. And, there was nothing off the shelf. This had never happened before. We started from a blank piece of paper. We started, I think, with the right ideas on democracy and the rule of law. But I think it was extremely difficult at that time with many countries to actually know what would happen in this sense. And I think I also asked the question of what if we hadn't done it? How would things look then? So I think it's a fascinating subject which we could speak on for hours. But I still think in the end it was better to take the countries in than to see them staying on the outside. Whether we could have done things differently in terms of how we paced the first years of membership is a question, perhaps. And I think we've learned many, many lessons for this. I haven't worked on enlargement now since 2003, I have to say. So that was quite some time ago now. But my impression was then that I think it was important to bring these countries into the European Union family, and very, very hard at that stage to see where we are now. I think it's, you know, we've been more years now, almost, we're getting to the stage when we've almost had more years after the process than before, as it were. So it's, yeah.
No, I tend to agree with you. You could say I would tend to agree, having worked and devoted so much of my life to this, but you're right, and especially that what if question, because when you look beyond the frontiers of the European Union today to the next ring of countries which are not members of the European Union, I think the degree of political and economic instability, uncertainty about the future, susceptibility to influences from various external powers. I think the countries that did join got enormous benefits from this, and the European stability on the whole, I think, benefited. But I think we were a bit over-optimistic about the time needed to complete the transition. And I don't think we should be that surprised if there are still some of these issues, and indeed problems of the rule of law questions, as we call them. They may be particularly acute in some of the not so new member states, but even some of our older member states face challenges from populism and so on, including the country, as I used to say, that I used to know best, the United Kingdom, which also faces populist challenges, I would say.
Exactly. No, I think this is something which merits a lot more time than we have today to look at, but absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Moving on with your career, Helen, you were head of unit for South Asia, quite a different story. And you were working with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. It must have been extremely challenging, especially given the various conflicts in the area, and of course, development challenges as well. What are your main takeaways from that experience? Does the EU have a real influence there? What did you feel was the added value from the EU's involvement with them?
Can I just say personally, Michael, this was something completely outside my comfort zone. And that's one thing I love about careers in the European Union. I had all the skills of how the system worked. I knew what our policies were, but I'd never been to any of the countries before. And I think there are 5 very distinct countries. And one thing that was fascinating for me is they're the countries that are around India, not India itself. So what you had in many of them was you had the influence of China, of India, and the history behind that. And every country would tell a different story. I think, you know, I looked at a country like Bangladesh, which had I think you could call it a soft coup at the time. And for a short time there, I think we were one of the partners who spoke constructively and actively to Bangladesh. At the time, relations with their neighbors weren't necessarily the easiest. And we had a lot of development going into that country. So I wouldn't say would bring about radical political change, but one thing the European Union did do in a country like Bangladesh was to take, for example, issues like cyclone proofing the country. And there was a cyclone, I think when I was very little, it would have been in the late 60s, where tens of thousands of people died. And then one in 2007, I think, where a few hundred. So we've made immense contributions through aid programs to the country, to education, many small things like that. So I think we're still a very valid partner. That was 12 years ago, I have to say, though, and I think a lot has changed since. And I think that, you know, it's very hard for me to say how things would be now working with those countries compared to where we were. Also, in a small country like the Maldives, we made a major difference to helping an election to be run freely and fairly. Sri Lanka was challenging. We had the situation with the civil war, but I think when the end of that came, we could go in with development assistance and with reconstruction. And Afghanistan and Pakistan, where shall I start? you know, many other players feel there, but in Afghanistan, we started to make inroads, for example, on issues such as police, slow reforms in the justice sector, combined with agriculture, you name it. So those are environments where we're certainly not the only player, but I think often we were a player which could make a distinct contribution. One of the areas we often focus on is governance, and I think however difficult that can be to work on, it's absolutely fundamental if a country wants to move ahead and reform. So in a little way on that, I think we have made a difference. Of course, that was pre-Lisbon, so things have moved on immensely in the last 12 years in different ways. But I think, you know, we can play a role. Difficult to say now, 12 years on, I think for me, exactly where we would stand in those areas. But just to give a little bit of a flavour of how I saw things at the time, and where we could play a role, it was very much in those other areas, perhaps where there were less focus from other donors or other parties. Yeah.
And perhaps broadening out that question and considering your work now in the External Action Service, what is the kind of division of responsibility between the EU institutions active in a particular country and the member states? You know, do the member states, as it were, keep the really hot foreign policy issues for themselves and delegate to the institutions the more kind of bread and butter everyday issues? Or do the EU, but the EU now has a high representative for foreign and security policy. So you would expect that on the EU side itself, there would also be an input into what we academics used to call high policy areas. How does that work out in practice?
Okay, well, I was very privileged in the sense that I was one of the people who saw the transition through from the pre-Lisbon days to post-Lisbon. If I remember in 2009, we would have had Javier Solana, Benita Ferrero-Waldner, I think. I have to get my net, just as I have to go back and do a bit of time travel.
Yeah.
And you would have had a member state minister chairing the Foreign Affairs Council with a rotating presidency. When the treaty came into force, we had Catherine Ashton, one person performing all those roles. And I think it's a very different. We now, when I was working in the Commission, we could be very outspoken on certain issues of Commission policy. I think when you're working for the European Union, sometimes you need to reflect more the consensus, which can make the job more challenging. But I think where there is unity, we can be strong. And I think the challenge is to take, in a sense, the level of unity up to a high level on particular issues. And that depends, I think, on the particular political environment we're working in and the context we see. You know, I think where we had in the past true unity on enlargement, I think it's very interesting now. I don't want to talk about Brexit, but I think when you have unity on an issue like that, the union can be still very strong. And in foreign policy now, I think one thing that always surprises me is when I look around the corridors of my building and I see people in uniform, military uniforms. I look at our missions. The role is so different now, and I think that's still growing. We're still developing and learning. But we've come an enormously long way there, but it's probably not something that's seen so much on the outside. I mean, I felt very much, we'll maybe move on to Norway in a minute, Michael, but I could feel, I think when you're in a third country representing the European Union, you see things in a very different light to perhaps the way you do in Brussels.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I'll just pause for a second to encourage our participants, if you do have any questions, use the Q&A function, and I will come around to your questions in a little while. Yeah. Stepping back from that for a moment, Helen, at the beginning, after the Lisbon Treaty, when the European External Action Service was set up, people were saying it's going to take time for it to settle in. It's going to take time for it to establish a kind of esprit de corps and to work out a smooth working relationship with the other institutions, with the Commission, for example. And particularly perhaps in the early days, there was a kind of feeling of rivalry to some extent. Now, the fact that there is a single person who is this double-hatted Vice President of the European Commission, responsible for external relations, but also High Representative. And now that we're into the third term of the third five-year term of this new arrangement functioning in practice. Have those things settled down? Is there a kind of esprit de corps building up so that one feels oneself to be a European diplomat? And what about rivalry with the Commission? Has that reached kind of cruising speed?
Okay, on the esprit de corps, it's very interesting because we're about to celebrate our 10th birthday. The celebrations will be a little bit different now, of course, because of the COVID situation. But watch this space from the 1st of December onwards to see how that will be done. It's interesting. I'm very happy to work in the External Action Service. I think we have a set of very able, creative people. When I first started to work with my new division, I had a fascinating set of colleagues, and I just want to remember this a little bit. I had my deputy was a Belgian diplomat. I had in the team Bulgarian, German, Czech, and I think, let me get this right. I had Swedish. So I had a real mix of member state diplomats who brought an immense experience. We always felt that if a Belgian and a Brit could agree on how things could be done, probably everybody else would come along with it. On top of that, I had people from the Council Secretariat and I had people from the European Commission. So for my first couple of years in the service, we had this wonderful coming together of people from different backgrounds. And one of the tasks we had at the time was to help our delegations work out how to work. What should their role be on the ground? How should they deal, for example, with the démarche from the European Union in diplomatic terms? What should our status be? All those issues. And we very quickly found, I think, very positive ways ahead on that in practical terms. And I feel that in delegations today, we have, I think sometimes it's when you're further away from the European Union, you see that we can be more effective. One of the points I often make is that, okay, when I was in Norway, I had 24 member states present locally, but in most countries in the world, there are only 7 European Union member states on the ground. That means there are 20 who are not. So then we have an immense added value in they have a representation through us and a contact point. We share our reporting. So I think that's one of the sides of the service that people don't necessarily see. I think in terms of esprit de corps, it's starting to build. One of the challenges we face is that member state diplomats can come into the service for a maximum of 2 terms of 4 years normally, sometimes up to 10. We hope they'll go back to their home services and say what an interesting time they had and encourage colleagues to come and work for us. But it's rather different from the feeling in the Commission or the Council where people tend to stay the whole of their career. And I think that's a continuing challenge. I think there are very serious efforts on the training side and mentoring and other ways to bring people together to overcome that. And I think that's starting to happen, but 10 years is still quite young for an organization in this sense, but I think immense progress has been made. Many things work coming to the Commission. Many things work very well on a practical level. I think there are still issues where, we could do better. We now have, however, more regular meetings of external relations commissioner groups, this sort of thing. But I'm not really directly involved that myself, but I think it's something where we need to think about being Team Europe in delegations as well as in Brussels. So, we're doing better, but I think there's always scope to work further on that.
That's encouraging. I think, I left the Commission in 2011, quite astonishingly. And those were still, relatively speaking, the early days. And there was at the time quite a bit of rivalry. There'd been the expectation that the Commission would no longer have geographic desks, for example, because this was the responsibility of the EAS. And then there were departments in the Commission, like the department dealing with trade, that saw itself as the continuation of the grand tradition of external relations, and that nonetheless continue some kind of geographic organization of its services. So there was a little bit of pushing and shoving and who was going to do what and so on. But and that's natural between any bureaucracy and any system whatsoever, I think, however long it's been there. Yeah. But perhaps with the years, these things have become a little bit less acute and that people have been learning how to work with each other constructively?
I think there'll always be an element of that. It's natural in an organization in a sense, but I think when we're on the ground, it tends to work better when you're actually doing things together in delegation,
Yes.
working more closely. And that's
Yes.
in a sense where, for me, I think it's really important. Yeah.
Yes. Helen, I've got quite a few more questions of my own and I would like to come to them, but let me filter in some questions from our participants. And here's one from Professor Chris Hill of Cambridge University, and who also teaches at SAIS in Bologna. And Professor Hill asks, did the US diplomatic machinery continue to liaise closely with the EAS despite President Trump's rather dismissive attitude vis-a-vis the EU? So, was there this kind of subterranean cooperation that continued between foreign services, notwithstanding the rather disdainful attitude of the head of government?
Thank you for a very interesting question, Professor Hill. I spent a lot of the time of the Trump administration actually as an ambassador in Norway. And I have to say, we had a good cooperation. The first couple of years I was there was still the President Obama. And there we had a very tight cooperation on something called TTIP, which a lot of people have forgotten about now, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So that was very close. And towards the end of my time there, we had the Trump administration. And I think one of the challenges is, of course, when the US changes administration, it changes all its ambassadors. So we had long gaps. And I think that was the case in many countries where, you didn't have an ambassador level interlocutor, but certainly on other levels, from my perspective, it continued, but it would be difficult for me to comment too far beyond that. My current role is very much within the organization, so I don't have direct contacts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I guess, as you say, in the US, so many posts change hands when there's a new administration. I remember when I was studying government, there was some article that said that a US administration changed after an election down to the level of dog catcher. If not quite that, clearly the administration is in a way more politicized than ours, although the EAS has this coming and going, as you've said, of national officials, but it also has, for 60 or 70% of the staff, a kind of permanent cadre of officials, so it's perhaps more stable. But
we have, and we also, sorry to interrupt, Michael, we have also, of course, a 4-year rotation. So if somebody does their 4 years, they will then be replaced the day they leave. So there's no gap in that sense. We run the timescale. So generally somebody can leave on the 31st of August and the next person arrives on the 1st of September in our system, which is, I think, generally is not always the case, but that's the majority would be the way it would look.
Yes. We have a question from Moritz Lutzberg, who, a couple of questions in fact, who asks about the role of the EAS when faced with some of the tougher foreign policy issues of recent times, for example, Belarus, or Turkey's conduct in the Eastern Mediterranean, or disinformation efforts by Russia or China. So working in the EAS, do these subjects reach people in the EAS? Are they hands-on on such matters? Or are these essentially matters for the member states and the EAS comes in only at the level of implementation?
Well, I think I'm not an expert on where we are with Belarus and Turkey, but I know they've been the subject of ministerial discussion. One thing I can say on disinformation is that the EAS has now a strategic communications set up with 3 task forces dealing with that. So, and we have the European Parliament watching very closely, and actually it's given us significant extra resources to deal with disinformation. I think the challenge is it's the tip of the iceberg or a drop in the ocean. There's so much to do, but compared to where we were a few years ago, we have a much bigger presence on that, and I think are gearing up. But it's not something we can do alone. It's something where we can play our role, but I think would need the support of other parties too. But if you look, I haven't got the web references in line now, but there's a lot of activity, particularly on disinformation through 3 task forces in different parts of the world. And I think that's something we didn't do in the past. We've put significant new resources into that over the last few years. Something we certainly wouldn't have done in the Commission days. It's a very new area, I think.
Yes, I mean, there used to be an attitude that, there are sort of national responsibilities and EU responsibilities. Never the twain shall meet.
Yeah.
And we were told to keep our hands off, as it were.
Yes.
Whereas now, on some of the hottest issues like disinformation, there's a real role for the European.
We've really been asked to get involved in that. Also in the COVID, just for the background, we were asked to get involved in repatriating 625,000 European citizens stranded. So there are many areas where there's demand from member states for us to be active, which are a little bit outside our former core business, I think. So that's been really interesting. And I think that will grow. Yeah.
You mentioned a number of times your posting to Norway, which must have been fascinating and challenging. I'd be interested to hear from you, both in terms of how it felt to be EU ambassador and your relations with the Norwegian authorities and with other ambassadors from the member states, to what extent, who maybe have spent their whole careers in a diplomatic service, but maybe haven't served in Brussels, and maybe wonder a little bit, what is this strange creature, an ambassador from the EU? I mean, how did that go? And maybe after tackling that, we could say a few things more on substance about Norway and its relation.
Yeah, I mean, from a personal point of view, I thoroughly enjoyed it, because I think maybe it was a colleague of mine, the Indian ambassador, who said one of the great things about the Norwegians is they have this wonderful enabling environment for people to work as diplomats. So I found the whole attitude very open and welcoming, and therefore I think you have a very good quality of dialogue and discussion. We can come a little bit onto the role of the European Union, but one thing I thoroughly enjoyed was meeting with my member state counterparts. As I said, there were 24 resident and 4 non-resident. I think, what do we have? Malta, Cyprus, Slovenia and Luxembourg. And colleagues from some of those countries would make a point to come to my monthly heads of mission meetings. And one thing we could do, and the government understood this as well, if a minister came to see 25 ambassadors together instead of seeing 25 times 1 ambassador, there's a tremendous mutual interest in that. So actually, I think we had significant added value in the convening power, in a sense, of the European Union delegation. That went right up to the level of Prime Minister, also with party leaders. They would see that as a very interesting group to talk to, ministers. So I found it extremely open, incredibly rewarding to have that level of contact. And I didn't have issues on that at all with the European Union do it. I think one of the things in a country like Norway is many of the member states' relations were very much focused on trade, on energy, on that side of things. So they didn't actually have as much time perhaps to focus on some of the other issues where we could bring some added value. Every country is different, but for me that was I think particularly interesting. And we had very good access to government, very good contacts, many visitors. I think from Brussels, it's a 2-hour flight, so very easy in both directions. So intense but interesting. And Norwegians particularly, I think, wanted to explain the country to the diplomatic corps and to people from the European Union institutions. So I was in Svalbard 3 times, I was in the Arctic 10 times, I was offshore a couple of times, underground, you name it. So really very open acceptance and, absolutely fascinating time. And I think all of the people I worked with understood the importance of the relationship with Europe, whether they wanted to be a member or not. It was understanding the key, that how essential that relationship was to a relatively small but rich country with European neighbours. Yeah.
In the UK, particularly during the debate leading up to the Brexit referendum and subsequently before Britain had fixed, if it's ever fixed, its vision for its future relations with the EU, there was a lot of talk about the Norwegian option
Mm.
and, you know, whether Britain should follow Norway in developing a very close relationship with the EU.
Mm.
And one of the main arguments of people who opposed that was they said that this would mean that the country would just be a decision taker. And if it were a member of the European Economic Area, or if simply it had a very close partnership with the EU, it would simply have to implement, for example, regulations, norms, standards, etc., decided in the European context, without having a word to say in formulating these standards. I mean, was that at all an issue in Norway? Are there any takeaways from that experience for the UK as it goes forward after the 31st of December? What's your feeling about that set of issues?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I'm not going to comment at all on the UK issues, but I think what I learned in Norway is that, in a sense, people understood that when you're in that position geographically, your neighbours are Sweden, Denmark, with whom you've had passport unions, I think, since the late 1950s or early 1960s. You've got incredibly strong Scandinavian, Nordic, and to a lesser extent, but growing now, Baltic cooperation. You know, you need to work with your neighbours, and you have many common interests and spend a lot of time on cooperating closely. So there's a very tight relationship there, and I think Norwegians understood that it was very much, given where they were, in the national interest to cooperate very closely. Another thing the Norwegians spent a lot of time on was trying to, when they saw a decision coming from the European Union that would have an impact, trying to find a way of becoming involved in that, either through, for example, some of the working groups the Commission would run, or through talking to their neighbours. And that was a really big part of their foreign policy and European activities, was to really look at the early stages of European policy making and see what they could do to influence or to make sure that it would be something which would take their interest into account. And I think for anybody who's more interested in that, just take a look at the Foreign Ministry website or the website of the Norwegian mission to the European Union. And that's a very clear policy coming from a high level in the government, very different in a sense in tone from others, but there's a recognition that it's the largest trading partner, it's the market for energy, it's the market for seafood, all these things. So if you want to have good markets, and also if you share views on issues such as climate change or human rights or shared values, you need to find a good way of being a partner. So that was very much what I felt, yeah.
Mentioning energy, I mean, Norway is a country that is both a major energy producer, clearly involved with hydrocarbons very profoundly, while at the same time being committed to the fight against climate change and other green issues. How did it cope with this? I mean, is there an element of schizophrenia there, or how do you do that if you're a major producer of oil and gas, but also committed to environmental protection and limiting climate change? How does a country like Norway cope with those apparent contradictions, if they are?
It's an issue I always found very interesting, Michael, because the domestic energy in Norway is almost 100% hydro or sustainable. And if you drive an electric car in Norway, which in Oslo 25% of people do, that car, you could say, is powered fully through green energy. A very different issue if you have one somewhere else in the European Union. But I think it's it is a dilemma. The argument would be that they are trying to do all they can to clean up the way they produce energy and gas and hydro. I think the other thing that was very important was linking into networks, so that the gas would be the backup fuel. For example, when in other parts of Europe you didn't have sufficient wind energy or sustainable sources, that you turn on the tap for that. So there was a lot of effort to look into those network issues as part of that. But there's no perfect answer on that. That's absolutely clear. There is an element of dilemma there. But I think the argument would be that gas is perhaps a cleaner fuel than some of the other alternatives in terms of coal or oil. for certain uses. But yeah, no perfect answer.
Right, this is a big debate, and
Yeah.
I'm particularly
Yeah.
interested in it because I follow quite closely the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And for a long time, there has been a plan, at least on the part of Cyprus and Greece and Italy, to try and build a gas pipeline from the Eastern Mediterranean through to Crete and the Peloponnese and into Europe to diversify Europe's energy supplies to some extent away from Russia. And there are many challenges to building this pipeline, technical, financial, and so on. But I just saw that there was a report from the European Ombudsman that challenged the whole notion of the EU becoming involved in a major project in the field of natural gas. And, you know, I've been saying and been reasonably convinced that natural gas is a transition fuel that can help us move the way from, you know, really polluting coal and heavy fuel oil through to renewables. But it seems that the European Ombudsman is not buying that.
Well, I think it's in the transition. It's a very interesting argument, and very much the argument is, I think, there that when the other systems aren't working or they get overloaded, then the gas comes in. But interesting. I don't know the role of the Ombudsman in energy policy is, if I'm honest, is a new one on me, Michael. I haven't seen that.
Me too.
Yeah.
I was rather surprised by that. Let me come to one or two questions from our participants. Now, maybe this is an issue, Helen, you haven't followed particularly closely, but I'm very interested in it myself because I'm teaching a course on scenarios on the future of Europe. But there's a question from Laura Fides, who asks about the conference on the future of Europe and some of the issues that will be debated there. And in particular, any possible implications for the European External Action Service. I mean, maybe because it's still very early days for the Conference on the Future of Europe, but if one were taking a completely fresh look and considering competences and responsibilities that could be shifted around in some way and some perhaps future treaty change that might emerge from the Conference on the Future of Europe, this is really futurology here. But can you see any changes that you would favor or that you think might strengthen the EU's foreign policy role?
Oof, that's a question I would like a little more time to think about, if I'm honest. But I think,
yes,
yeah, it's a tricky one because we see now we're being called on to work on many more issues relating to security and defence. You know, there's the question on consular issues, for example, all of these things that would need to be considered. And I think it's very, very difficult at this stage for me, Michael, to go beyond that. I think certainly those in terms of broad areas, definitely. I think security defence would be two. Should we take more of a consular role is a question that's come up in the past. No clear view on that yet, but pros and cons to all of that. Yeah.
We're getting some questions, Helen, which ask you to stand back a bit from your particular experiences. And as someone extremely conversant with the setup in Brussels and some of the challenges that the EU faces. And there's a question here about public opinion and the fact that there seems to be a gap between the conviction of people in Brussels, like you and me, who spent a lot of time in the institutions, that the EU brings real benefits to the population, and perceptions on the part of the public, particularly given the populist wave that we're seeing now, which rather doubts the benefits of the EU. So the question is, whether the institutions themselves could do more to educate the public in the member states about the EU and how it functions.
Thank you. A very interesting question. It's always been a dilemma as to how much the EU institutions should do and how much, in a sense, member states could do. And I think as EU officials, we will know how many things we have to do and how small we are, in a sense, in terms of working on these issues compared to, for example, national administration. So if we were to do that, the question would be, in a sense, how do we do that effectively? Would we have the resources to do it? I think in the end it needs to be something that really becomes a team effort. But one of the things I very much enjoyed in my time in Norway was working with some of the European programs, with Horizon 2020, with the Erasmus program where we had the 30th birthday, and then with Creative Europe. And I think one of the challenges we have is to get that message out, because now I think we're talking, if I remember correctly, of a million Erasmus babies was the expression at the time, which is a massive success to have had a program to involve so many young people in educational exchanges, and to have that benefit and not be able, for people not to be aware of that. I think the challenge there is, what can we do to make sure that those messages get out? The other message I think all of us see sometimes is when something goes wrong, it's Brussels' fault. When something works, it's the member state. So there's a real need, I think, for a team effort on that sort of thing. And I think now, indeed, when we're designing programs and policies, more thought needs to be given to explaining this. I think also it's very interesting. When I was in Norway, the Europe minister at one stage there, he admitted that because of free movement, there were villages in Norway and industries which could continue to thrive because they had, for example, people coming to parts of the country where there was a demand for skills and not enough people from Norway to go. So there are lots of stories that need to be told, I think, and I don't think the European Union institutions alone can do that. I think this really needs to be a question of a joint effort in one way or another.
I think you're right about that, and maybe it's for the institutions above all to provide the best possible user-friendly information about what's happening in the EU. And I think there have been enormous improvements in that. I mean, for my courses at SAIS, I provide a lot of documents and links to the websites of Directorates General in Brussels. And for any policy issue these days, if you're already interested in it and you're proactive, you can extract really detailed information and up-to-date information. It used not to be up-to-date. You know, websites were notoriously out of date. So, I mean, I do think the institutions have improved enormously their openness and transparency. In the years when I worked in the Belgium building, which is sort of emblematic of the Commission headquarters, I thought that it literally was much more transparent. It's a glass house, in fact, than almost any national administration that tends to do things very secretively in general. And of course, visible figures like the High Representative or members of the Commission, you know, they give speeches and so on. But I do think that they reach mainly people who are already active and interested. And I think to reach the public more generally, as you suggested, it's probably a role for the member states, for ministers, people at different levels of government. If they themselves are convinced that the EU brings benefits to their country, their region, their city, their industry, their sector, they should be the ones telling this story. But politicians don't often see votes in it. And as you say, they're very often more inclined to blame Brussels and the credit where it's good and to blame Brussels otherwise. It is a standing problem.
But I sometimes think we need to wind the clock back to pre-1992, Michael, which we remember well. People take so many things for granted now in terms of crossing borders. One of the things the Norwegians had through the EEA was the possibility to live, work, study, invest in other EEA countries. Where did all this come from? I think it's so easy to forget. And I think, you know, yes, you know, this is something we all need to work on, but I'd also like to see more education on this. I think it should be a part of a general knowledge, in a sense, to know a little bit more about the European Union than many people do, and where these freedoms have come from, and where we were in maybe some role play of how things were in 1988 would be very interesting these days.
That's right.
Incredible.
I mean, in a way, I think COVID, you know, should be making people more aware of that, because anybody, let's say, under the age of what? Under the age of 40, I don't know, has only ever known an open Europe, open borders, free movement, and so on. And suddenly, with the first wave of COVID, we had the closure of borders. And I think that might have brought home to some people for the first time what a kind of miracle it is in the history, you know, to have these open borders. And as soon as they're closed, I mean, I would love now at Christmas to visit my family in Berlin, and my wife would like to come and see her family in Brussels. And we just don't know whether it's going to be possible, whether the borders can be open or not.
And the fact, you know, also we forget things like open skies, you know, where did the budget airlines come from? All of these things, and the fact that you can buy a television in one country and take it to another and plug it in. So there's a great need, I think, to get the message out. But COVID has, I think, really made people realize perhaps, yeah, I think we'll have to see what happens in the year after it, but it has made everybody think. Yeah.
Helen, I wanted to ask you a question about any particular challenges that you might have felt at any stage as a woman working in these institutions. And how has the situation changed over the years as far as women in the institutions are concerned? Has it ever been an issue from your perspective? What thoughts do you have on that?
I think I've been really, maybe it's the generation I am. I've actually found it quite easy. It's not been a problem for me, but I have heard of cases for people who have had more problems. I think now for anybody wanting to come into the institutions is actually a good moment, because we're really doing all we can to have proper gender balance through the organisation. I was involved in our annual presentation of our administrative budget and discharge to the Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and you know, we were looking at the figures of how we're doing on that. You know, for the External Action Service, to give an example, I think overall we're 48% women, 52% men. But when you get to middle management, we're now at, for example, we're 28% of our ambassadors are women. That doesn't sound much, but in 2017 it was 22%. And we're actually competing for the same good candidates with member states who are pressured to get their figures up as well. So I think there's been a real effort made, and I think it's just on a personal level, maybe 2 female high representatives, and we've had a female secretary general in the External Action Service. There's been a lot of attention paid to this matter, but I think I've never found it a problem, and I think now the issue is to help younger women coming in to make sure they have really good chances. So for our part, you know, we're doing a lot on mentoring, we're doing a lot on more flexible working arrangements, which aren't just for women. I think being family right now, and COVID, if anything, it's taught us anything, it's taught us of a need for that. But we have many more examples, for example, many more opportunities, for example, of coaching, of specific training for young women coming in who want to get into management positions. So I think now that has, you know, we're in a much better place than we were a few years ago. Still some way to go, but that's the same in all member state administrations as well. But I'm very interested personally to see what we will learn from COVID, where I think, you know, teleworking has been a major challenge to families as well. And I'm sure I would think, I very much doubt that the institutions will go back to 100% working in the office. So we're at a very interesting moment right now in terms of what this means for all of us in terms of our working methods. It would be unthinkable, probably even 2-3 years ago, to think that everybody would telework part of the time. And just think what's happened since March. It's amazing.
Yeah. Having this conversation, I can't help thinking back just how times have changed. To the moment when I was working in a cabinet that, in other words, in the private office of the commissioner, where you had worked as well. And for the purposes of this story, I will name no names, but one doesn't have to be clairvoyant to work it out. And it was in the very early days of computers. And the more senior somebody was, the less likely it was that they would be using their computers, you know. And their computers sat on their desk a little bit as a decoration. But I had one, and I was using it for internal communication, sending messages inside the organization, writing documents, and so on. And then I wanted to have access to the internet. And I had to write a note to my head of cabinet, the chief of staff of the commissioner. I would have thought he had better things to do, to explain why I wanted to have access to the internet, what justified it in my job, and so on. And then he had to deliberate seriously on whether or not to grant this. Yeah. That's not so many years ago. You know.
No, Michael, and now we went actually last year, the External Action Service went on to a system of everybody having laptops with all sorts of good programs and stuff. So we basically on, I think it was the 17th of March, we knew that from the 18th we would be teleworking. Everybody took their computers home. And apart from the fact, I think on average people are spending, well, I've been spending probably 5-6 hours a day on one form of video conference at certain times, which I think it has its own challenges, and that's one thing we need to look at. But we've really continued business as usual. You know, we did major meetings, we did our whole ambassadors conference, 140 ambassadors and heads of mission, all online. We had to time it at lunchtime because that's when you get most time zones together from east to west. But the thought of doing that even 2-3 years ago is unthinkable. And I was saying earlier to somebody that, you know, with a global network, we can now train everybody together. It doesn't matter where they are, but you know, you can. So there are many things we've learned from these last few months. And I think that's also, it does come back to the issue of modernizing our working methods and, you know, being, I think, ultimately, hopefully more family friendly. We have to learn, of course, to avoid a digital overload, which is one of the challenges we all face now. But I think we've taken a massive step forward in these last few months for all the wrong reasons due to COVID in how we work. And we'll hopefully learn from that. Yeah.
But more generally, and, you know, I think for our last few questions, we're really focused on young people who are interested possibly in working in the institutions and what the experience is like. But would you say that the general atmosphere now working in the institutions is a modern one, similar to what a young person might find in the private sector if they chose to go into the private sector? Or is there still this time lag in sort of management techniques, approaches, style, manner? I remember another, sorry about all these anecdotes, time when my boss, who was of a nationality that I will not mention, called me into his office one morning, and he said, "I was looking for you at 9 o'clock last night, and I couldn't find you. Where were you?" I think we've moved on from that. But what is the sort of feel for working in the institutions these days?
I mean, we're not Google or Amazon or anything like that, Michael. I think we are still an administration, and we still have something you will know. I don't know how to translate this, the signataire process, even though it's electronic these days. So you have layers of authority.
Signature file.
Yeah, clearing a file. You have to, it starts out with you, and then it goes to your head of division, your director general. So probably, I think sometimes the hierarchies have got bigger in certain parts of the organization. So we still have that process of clearance, but I suspect that is familiar to any public sector organization and to any ministry, not the private sector. But we're really trying to simplify on other things. I think management styles are improving and techniques. I mean, you can't be a manager in the organization now without having had some degree of management training, which is a big change from the past. We have, as I said at the beginning, you know, we have people have to go through assessment centers before they can get their first management post. And that includes in our service people coming from the outside as well. So there's I think it makes sure that the casting errors we had in the past are less these days. One thing I like is there's a lot of teamwork. There's a good spirit in many parts of the organization. I won't say that it's flat, but I think the style in a sense has changed. A lot of responsibilities put on middle managers to look after staff and to find good ways of working. And I think middle managers are much better prepared for that now than they would have been, Michael, in the early days there. And I think the 9 o'clock issue, I think we're getting away from the sort of 9 till 7 in the office that probably was the norm when I started, with a long lunch break, to more flexibility. That helped. It's helped a lot by IT, of course. You know, it doesn't really matter sometimes if somebody's present or not. So that culture is changing, yeah. But I wouldn't compare us to the private sector necessarily, cutting edge private sector yet. Having said that, I think the people we work with are very special. We work with very good colleagues. I have an incredibly motivated bunch of people of different ages, and that environment for me is positively infectious and always has been. You know, a lot of fun.
That's terrific. And that does take us to another question from one of our participants who asked, you know, what is the kind of skill set that a person should have who might be interested in working for these institutions?
Right.
What diplomatic skills, other skills, or personality profile, can one say that?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually advise anybody who's seriously interested to take a look at the website of the European Personnel Selection Office of EPSO, because there's a lot of focus now on competencies when people come in, and those competencies will range from languages. You have to have 2 languages to enter, and you have to pass a pretty high level of a 3rd language in order to get your first promotion. So I think having English and French is a massive asset, and I think then languages such as Spanish, Portuguese, German, whatever, can be very helpful. So I think for me, you know, it's taken for granted that you have 2 or 3 fluent languages.
Yes.
That's very different from many, even diplomatic services. I think that's something that's unique to us. In terms of skill set, I mean, I think very decent IT skills, very important: PowerPoint, Excel, all the usual programs. Teamwork now is important. I think you probably wouldn't get through a recruitment interview without showing a good sense of interest in team. I think people need to be quite self-starters to come in. You don't come in and expect a long training program. You're often thrown right in to a job. So being prepared for that, I think, is really important. And that would obviously vary a little bit from job to job. But in the External Action Service now, we're developing training routes for people coming in. For example, any junior diplomat coming in, and we've just got 2 competitions underway to recruit for the first time our own junior diplomats. They will go through some kind of European diplomatic program when they come in, to give them the right skills, for example, in protocol, in foreign policy, and knowing how to act as a diplomat. And I think that's something that was unheard of probably 20 years ago. And we also have training paths for people wanting to be in financial areas of work, in assistance to our heads of delegation, our heads of administration. So there's a lot happening there to help people once they're in. But I think, I mean, Michael, you were talking about competencies and issues you're working on in terms of employability. And I think, you know, that I have incredibly qualified young people coming in who have a really good set of personal, academic and IT and other skills. So we can really pick and choose the best, I think, still. Often that can be quite daunting. So I think it's an excellent chance maybe to look for internships in our organization or similar, or short employment experiences elsewhere, which will help you build those core skills. I take very few people in as a first job. Normally people have either significant experience in short-term jobs or internships, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, we lay a lot of emphasis on internships, and in fact, for the master's degree that I'm responsible for, it's actually an integral part of the program, and students are pretty much obliged. They could write a long paper, research paper as an alternative, but we very strongly encourage them during their second summer to do an internship, which I think is extremely valuable in preparing for a competition and for their subsequent career, and also networking. Sometimes it takes students a while to realize what is actually meant by networking. It's kind of something that everyone always insists is of great importance, but it's a bit of an abstract idea. But I mean, how did you go about networking in the earlier phases of your career?
Yeah, I mean, my first real networking experience was when I first came to Brussels, and I was deputy representative in a working group in the council. So I had all these, at the time it was just 15 people around the table. But then, you know, realizing that you needed to get to know those people to get your job done. So I think it was a question of, you know, being something that didn't come naturally to me, sort of saying, taking somebody for a cup of coffee or having a chat, or making sure if there was a reception or some kind of event or seminar you could go to, that you went, and you went outside your comfort zone to go and introduce yourself to the person around you. So that's really how Brussels works, I think, isn't it? You know, you need to, there are those circles, and it's a big world, but it's a small world.
Yes, absolutely.
Having the courage to take the first few steps, I think, is fundamental.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You mentioned languages, and you have a question from someone who's asking about particular languages. I think the dilemma can be sometimes for somebody who has several languages. They usually have English, but not always French. Is French as important as it always was? I mean, if somebody has several languages but not French, do they have a chance to get through this process? Is French indispensable?
You certainly have a chance to get through the competition, but my advice would be, if you don't have French, partly because of living in Brussels, I would prioritize it as a language to learn. I think, you know, it's still very much in the environment. If people aren't speaking English, which they tend to in most meetings I go to, French is going to be the language they will speak. So I think the advice would be, yes, you have, for the concours, if you can take the main part, or you have English as a language and you have another European Union language for your second part, I think that's no problem. But actually, from the point of view of thriving when you're working in the organization, I think it's just good advice to pick up French as quickly as you can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Helen, you've been fantastically forthcoming and generous with your time. And I've seen from the flow of questions and the response from students in particular that they very much appreciate it. I would also like to express my gratitude to you for receiving our students on their career trek to Brussels. And we hope, COVID permitting, that we'll be able to repeat that experience in person before too long.
Yeah.
And we'd like also very much to have you in person to meet the students and to interact with them in Bologna when that comes possible again. So thank you so much, Helen. And it's been a pleasure for me, and I'm sure the students and other participants have appreciated very much your openness and willingness to respond to questions.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's been a pleasure for me too. And I indeed, as you say, Michael, I sincerely hope that we can welcome a group to Brussels in person. And I really look forward to the opportunity to visiting Bologna one of these days to interact in person with all of you as well. So
Thank you so much, Helen, and my best to our common acquaintances and friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise, Michael. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.